Congressman, thank you for joining us today. We are honored. I would just add to those general remarks that you have been a tremendous friend to the Jewish community over the years, and that's something that I know we all appreciate. So if possible, I'd like to start off with having you just give us a general picture of what's going on in Washington, D.C. What are the precautions like? What steps are they taking to ensure safety of our elected officials and buildings? And how is that impacting your day-to-day process?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Lisa Quigley, Jim's chief of staff, and he's saying that the host won't let him in.
Oh, okay, great. Let us work on that briefly.
Thank you.
Lisa, are you in DC right now, or are you here in Nashville? Okay.
Can you go over there and scroll down so I can see who's participating in this? Stop.
Y'all see me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's okay. You missed your introduction, but I imagine you know the drill. I just wanted to start off by saying thank you for being with us today. We're honored to have you and want to thank you for being such a longtime friend of the Jewish community. And I had asked if you could maybe start off by telling us just a little bit about the general environment in Washington, D.C. right now, what's being done for protection for our officials and buildings, and how is that impacting your process?
Well, these are strange times. And on the good news part, I've never seen such bipartisan cooperation. I don't know how long it will last, but we have spent about $3 trillion of not taxpayer money, but future taxpayer borrowing in order to jumpstart the economy and try to help people who are severely injured by the current depression era levels of unemployment and the health hardships that we've seen in places like New York and New Jersey. Tennessee, of course, hasn't been exempted. So the bipartisanship is good. These bills have passed almost unanimously. Now, whether the 4 bills that have already passed are any indication of the future, we don't know. I will go back next week to Washington, and there will be a 5th bill, which will look like it will be at least $1 trillion, maybe more than that. It could even be $2 trillion. It's going to be called the CARES 2 Act, after the $2.2 trillion CARES 1 Act. But Congress has passed a series of 4 already, including the CARES 1 Act, and maybe we should review the bidding. The first one was a relatively small $8.3 billion bill, primarily for testing. Congress doubled or tripled the president's request because he severely underestimated the coming crisis. The next bill was about $150 billion to provide things like paid sick leave so that people were not showing up at work who were carrying the coronavirus and other diseases. But that turned out not to be enough. So the monster CARES Act was passed, 2.2 trillion, a whole panoply of programs. And then after that, the PPP loan program had to be renewed. So that bill ended up being 484 billion. So as I say, the next bill, which we'll probably vote on Thursday of next week, we don't know the size of it yet or its contents. It looks like it's mainly going to be focused on state and local government. Here in the city of Nashville, we have a $300 million hole. And so far, Nashville's only gotten $120 million to repair that hole. The state of Tennessee is estimated to have $1.5 billion hole, but it's amazing. The state has already received $2.3 billion from the federal government, money which has not been allocated or spent. Excuse me. So some people have gotten less than they need to fill the hole. Some people have gotten actually more. The big fight seems to be between the Democratic push for more aid for state and local government, because not every state is as fortunate as Tennessee, versus the Republican push to exempt companies from liability if their employees return to work or if a customer sneezes on the premises, they don't want to get sued as a result. So we don't know the outcome of that battle yet. So that's basically what's going on in Washington right now. I hope bipartisanship will continue, but it looks like bipartisanship is about to end, and we'll get back into more normal partisan fray. Before I leave the subject of money, these numbers are huge. They don't fit on a calculator. So let's review the bidding on million, billion, and trillion. The way I remember it best is 1 million seconds is 12 days. 1 billion seconds is 32 years, and 1 trillion seconds is 32,000 years. You're headed back toward dinosaur time. So you remember we've already passed about 3 trillion in bills, and it could be 5 or 6 trillion before the summer is out. And that's just in the emergency spending. This doesn't count regular congressional spending, which is another huge amount. So it's likely that the deficit this year will be between 4 and maybe 8 trillion dollars as a one-year deficit. The entire debt for America since Andrew Jackson was president is about $25 trillion. So this is spending on the scale of all of World War II. This is spending on the scale greater than the New Deal or the Great Society. So this is truly stupendous, but it's designed to get us through what is currently a cash crunch, because the fundamentals of America are still very strong. We haven't handled the COVID crisis very well. We lag that, but in every other particular, America is still the envy of the earth. So why don't I stop there, and happy to focus on whatever you would like to focus on.
So one of the things that we've had some questions about is funding for protection for the elections in the fall. So do you think that the next stimulus bill will or should include federal funding to make sure that people can either vote by mail, or what are your thoughts about what's needed to make sure that we have a fair election in the fall?
Well, I'm all for voting by mail. Every state already has it. We call it absentee ballots, and most voters will want to vote absentee this time, at least if the crisis continues or if there are flare-ups. The trouble is a partisan one, and Trump has said it very plainly. He said if we have voting by mail, Republicans will never win another election. I don't really view this in partisan terms. I think it's just a convenience and a safety issue. It's dangerous for poll workers. It's dangerous for folks who show up at the polls, even if they stand 6 feet apart. Because I don't know how much you've traveled around Tennessee. In Nashville, people are okay about wearing masks, although I got a report that today at Target on White Bridge Road, half the people were not wearing masks.
Ugh.
Out in the rural areas, like nobody wears a mask. In fact, you're almost considered a wimp if you have one. So this is a problem, because Trousdale County on the other side of Wilson County, Lebanon, actually has the highest number of cases. 2,000 inmates in Tennessee have already tested positive, so it's spreading like wildfire, and prison guards return home. But back to the election issue, we need convenient voting. Now, we do have 3 weeks of early voting in Tennessee, and that enables people to vote ideally at a less congested, more convenient time. But the real tragedy is people haven't been taking advantage of that. Overall voter turnout is among the worst in the nation in Tennessee. There are actually fewer voters in the latest mayoral election in Nashville in 2019 than there had been in Nashville in 1971 or in 1968. That's just humiliating. Back to the money question on voting. Congress has already given states so much money to spend on voting that Tennessee currently has in its accounts drawing interest. I think it's $27 million. And money has been there for years that they refuse to spend on upgrading our voting machines so they're less able to be hacked by either foreign or domestic, hackers. So it's kind of incredible that it's this difficult to help states run free and fair elections. But voter suppression is still a very real thing, especially in the South. It's kind of shocking that, the current governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, built his career on voter suppression in the state of Georgia and beat Stacey Abrams in the gubernatorial contest recently. So we've got to be aware of political realities. For those who are for a League of Women Voters type, reforms, good luck with that, because one party is not going to accept those at all.
Are there any things that you would recommend that we could work on at a state and local level to try to make voter registration and safe elections a bipartisan issue?
Well, to make it a bipartisan issue, you're going to have to change some souls in the other party, because remember, they like elections determined primarily by older, white, conservative voters. They're going to hold on to that come, hell or high water. We currently have a Secretary of State in Tennessee who wouldn't mind emulating Bryant Kemp's career. He even had printed a few years ago stickers so that if you ever voted in Tennessee, it didn't just say "I voted." It had his name on the sticker, as if you'd voted for him. This is a sort of overreach and almost political aggression that is taking place. If you look at Tennessee's current voter registration laws, they're unbelievably complex. I can go into some of the details if you want, but it's really almost like a poll tax. It's a trap for the unwary. One of the most offensive parts of it is our young students who go off to college, and maybe they go to college in another state. They're excited about voting for the first time. Guess what they get met with? They can't vote for the first time unless they come back home and vote in person at that precinct.
That
Now,
happened to my daughter.
That really is an abuse of our young people, because you hold out this hope, you want them to participate in democracy, and then their hopes get crushed. So, but there is an exception, by the way, if your daughter wants to vote. It turns out that you can vote absentee at your out-of-state college campus if you vote at the ROTC center at that campus. But that's an unwritten exemption that's not available anywhere. But I think the thinking behind it was they thought more conservative students would probably be more likely to take advantage of that. So it's another way that looks maybe neutral on its face, but is substantively very, very partisan.
Well, we have State Senator Dickerson joining us in a couple of weeks, and he is a Republican, but he has expressed concern about making sure that there are safe and fair elections in Tennessee in the fall. So we'll keep our fingers crossed on that.
Well, Steve has helped me on the Project Register thing. We've registered a lot of young people in Tennessee high schools, and especially in Nashville. Mm-hmm. It's now a statewide effort. So Steve has been very helpful in that. But one disappointment was, even though we increased high school voter registration by thousands of people, only 2% of them actually ended up going to vote.
Yeah.
We did everything. We had hip hop videos, we had songs, we had everything to appeal to students, and they did register. But then when it came down to it, they were what we call low information voters. Mm-hmm. They didn't feel comfortable going to the polls or casting a ballot, which is kind of embarrassing.
Yeah, it is. A couple of other questions we got going back to the pandemic. Are there efforts that you feel like will be made in this next round of legislation to correct the issue with big businesses seeing a lot of the benefits from some of the initial aid packages?
Well, some of the larger businesses that got aid and probably not intended as beneficiaries, some of them were shamed into returning the money. Right. You've seen those names. The Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago had an excellent list of 200 public companies which have access to the whole range of capital markets, and they also got this aid. Now, there are probably some sectors, like none of us want the airlines to go out of business, and some planes are flying without hardly any passengers, and we're making them fly because airlines are essential. But there are some other businesses that got special treatment in the statute. For example, some of the largest hotel chains in America are considered small businesses under the statute because as long as each individual hotel doesn't have more than 500 employees, then they are a small business. Well, some of the biggest chains in America are far from a small business. The same was true in restaurant chains. So there's going to be abuse in any system, and you want people to be smart and know the rules and have lawyers and accountants who can help them figure it out. But there's so many smaller businesses, mom and pop shops and barbershops and beauty parlors that don't have, that advantage. And a lot of them are hurting, but a lot of big companies are, having trouble. You saw Neiman Marcus went under yesterday, J. Crew the day before that.
Yep.
This is literally another Great Depression. We thought that the recession of 2008 was bad, but with today's unemployment numbers and only likely to go up, and we don't know when really the crisis will end, because most states are loosening restrictions, but while the government has the power to shut down a business, it can't open it up successfully. Customers have to want to go, and they have to feel safe in going.
Right.
And as if people aren't wearing masks and if there are other flare-ups, why then we're going to have another spike in cases.
Right. Another question that's come up is in a number of the rallies that have been happening in different states to try to pressure a reopening, there's a pretty well documented series of anti-Semitic messages that are included among those rallies. So people are using Nazi imagery, making very explicit anti-Semitic posters or comments. And so far, we haven't seen anybody other than the Jewish community itself kind of calling this out. Do you think there's hope that other people are going to take this up and condemn these types of actions?
Well, I'm not Jewish, but I totally condemn it. It's totally wrong. It's outrageous that this still is a fight we have to fight. But it's no secret to Federation members that anti-Semitism is not only not dead, it's alive and well. It's flourished in Europe, and shockingly, we have it here, which has generally been a little bit more open-minded than some countries. But we've also had terrible racism too. This latest shooting, oh my God.
Right.
On video, you can't jog while black. And too many white folks have dismissed their fears as paranoid. Well, we have now so many documented cell phone of police shooting black people in the back.
Right.
These two private citizens, father and son, murdering someone with a shotgun because he was jogging in their neighborhood.
Right.
This is just unthinkable, unspeakable, except it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Now, economic turmoil does bring out the worst in people. This is why Hitler was able to rise up in Germany, because the Weimar Republic was in terrible economic shape. But that's still no excuse for this sort of cruel extremism. And a lot of these folks, let's be honest, they're so ignorant, they don't know what they're doing, really. That's not an excuse for their misbehavior, but to use those symbols and to rekindle all that hate is the worst possible thing they could be doing.
I agree. Another question that I got, shifting back to economics, is can you talk about the possibility of getting the SBA to exempt nonprofits from the PPP rules 31 and 37?
Okay, I can't remember off the top of my head what those rules are.
I can't
Right.
either, unfortunately, but if the person who asked the question wants to step in, they can.
Let me do it.
I wish we could. Okay.
Congressman, hi, it's Eric Stillman.
Okay.
The two rules in question would potentially cause an issue for nonprofits, because if there's a budget surplus or there's funds in an endowment or bank account, then it could be perceived as the institution is profitable, had other sources of funds to go to, and then the forgiveness factor would be taken away.
Well, I haven't heard of this change except in the context of universities, because I know Vanderbilt was very self-conscious about having, and they didn't apply for a PPP loan, but they were used as a conduit by the Department of Education to get aid to some of their poorest students.
Mm-hmm.
So it looked like on paper that Vanderbilt got $5 million, but that was not for Vanderbilt. It was for the poor students who do attend Vanderbilt, who are no longer in class and sometimes had no place to live. So Vanderbilt didn't benefit at all, but there was some public shaming going on, not only at Vanderbilt, but for other major colleges and universities. So that's just stupid. We tried to get changes in the PPP rule and bill number 4 that we passed, the $484 billion, but Mitch McConnell said absolutely no changes. Now, outside of the law, there have been some public shaming cases that have forced some companies to return some of the money. You've seen some of them listed, but many other companies made out like bandits. I hate to see any nonprofit injured in doing their good work, but we also have to realize too that no law, no matter how large or generous, can ever make anybody whole for what's happened. I'm particularly worried about our kids who are missing class. And while some of them are diligent telelearning students, others not so much. And I know that we need a law against refrigerators being that close to a laptop, because I'm suffering from that even in my own home right now. Because, or maybe we need a time lock on the refrigerator so that it can't be opened except at mealtime. But even then, I'd probably raid too much of what's in the refrigerator. So this is just a crisis, but we'll get through it somehow. I wish we were behaving as well as South Korea or Germany, because they seem to have managed the crisis so much better than America.
So we have a number of questions coming in on the chat. Would you prefer me to just keep moderating those, or are you okay with people asking you questions directly who are on the call?
Oh, fine, to do it direct, however they want to do it.
Okay, so I think what we're going to do for the rest of the time is, if you're on the Zoom call, instead of posting your question in the chat, go ahead and ask your question to Jim directly. And then we also have some people watching on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, if you can put your questions in the chat there, we do have somebody moderating that. And we can ask those questions in this format here. So if you're live on the Zoom call, go ahead and unmute yourself, and you can ask the questions directly to Congressman Cooper instead of posting them in the chat.
Hi, Jim. It's Avi. I'm going to ask a quick question.
Hey, Avi.
Hi. Any thoughts on how you think these conventions are going to run in the summer if they're not going to be able to meet in person? How do you think they might be managed?
Well, I hate to say it, but aren't conventions obsolete, and haven't they been obsolete for a long time, especially if there's no competition for either party's nominee? It's fun to get together and party, but that's also a big health risk right now, at least from what we know, and especially as so many people who have COVID are asymptomatic. That's a genuinely scary situation. So it could be that this could be the first year in American history we have to have just a virtual convention. And Democrats, generally speaking, are the poor political party. I would love to see the party spend the money that would have been spent on entertaining people at the convention, spent on helping our candidate win. And hey, I'm going to say something partisan here, but if we can't beat the worst president in American history, that's pretty pathetic. So we've got to get our act together and use the money in more constructive ways, I think. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it'll all be cleared up by August or whenever, but virtually everything possible is being canceled.
Congressman, question for you on healthcare insurance.
Mm-hmm.
For years I've been against having Medicare for all or whatever, but after what's happened with so many people getting laid off now and losing their insurance, is this the time maybe that we think about health care for all, similar to every other economy in the world?
We definitely need health insurance for everybody, and there are different ways of having that. With a Republican Senate, we'd be essentially wasting our time. They're not going to seriously consider it. I want to be open-minded because I definitely want health care for all. But the best way for Tennessee to get that, and remember, we're one of the #1 laggards, is to start here at home and get Medicaid for all. We're turning down a free $1 billion a year. Even the densest person in the other party can understand what a shame that is. They would never turn down that amount of money for any other area of life. All people deserve health insurance. All people deserve health care. There's no hope of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness without health care and health insurance. And here we've been handed this gift in Tennessee that we continue to turn down. We've already lost more hospitals in Tennessee, 12 hospitals per capita, than any other state in America. And even our current Republican governor has opened up Medicaid to anyone who has a COVID-related symptom. So I've asked the governor, how about if they have comorbidities? How about if they have diabetes too, or heart disease, or hypertension, or something like that? How about allowing those folks to get help? And so the camel's nose is under the tent here, since he's admitted COVID people. They all have comorbidities. So let's go ahead and work on that exemption. There's another strategy too, if we can't necessarily get it statewide. The governor, with his voucher bill, singled out Davidson and Shelby County for special treatment. a judge has overturned that approach, but that at least shows that you don't necessarily have to legislate for the whole state. And Davidson County and Shelby County, it would solve 80% of the problem if we could let those two counties get Medicaid for all. So there are ways to solve this problem that are much more doable, because as long as Mitch McConnell's in the Senate, as long as the Senate's Republican, we'd be wasting our effort.
Question, Congressman Cooper.
Mhm.
This is Marshall Millman talking. I want to ask you a question about how you see the inflation curve playing out in the future with all these billions and trillions being thrown out. I think it's appropriate to do that, because otherwise people would die of starvation and other causes. We don't want to see the suffering that took place 90 years ago to 80 years ago, with the Great Depression that I've learned so much about from my own parents who actually lived it. Nonetheless, when people get back to work and start making money again, I can see the possibility of huge inflation for a decade or two following that might be ruinous to our economy as well, because of all this money going out right now.
Well, macroeconomics is a complicated issue. Let me just give it a shorthand answer. Both inflation and deflation are terrible things. And I think we have probably overlearned the lesson from the Paul Volcker era and from times before that, that inflation is the number one enemy. And it may be because inflation is a hidden tax. That's the politicians' way of paying for things without putting their fingerprints on the taxation tool. But deflation for the last, 10 years or so has been a stalking horse for terrible problems, and a number of other nations, including Japan, that we're sharing more and more characteristics with, have had chronic deflation. So both are threats, and we depend on the Fed, and we should be able to depend on Congress more, because monetary policy has actually worked has worked better in recent years than fiscal policy has. Congress has been negligent, in fact, probably guilty of malpractice by not using fiscal policy more. This will be an interesting test, the current spending binge, because if you're an old-fashioned Keynesian, and even Richard Nixon once said, we're all Keynesians now. You know what a liberal is? It's a conservative who's scared by coronavirus. It's incredible how we've gotten bipartisan support for the biggest expansion of government imaginable. Now, they will not admit that necessarily, but this is astonishing. Republicans all voting for something bigger than the New Deal or Great Society. That's a remarkable era. So we face an interesting political question. It's a little bit like socialism is actually more popular in America than people want to admit. We all get our electricity from TVA, and our retail distributor of electricity is also government owned. Hey, we got to realize it's not, but see, the Republicans like to badmouth things, and they're now even calling our public schools, they're calling them government schools to make them look scary or something. Well, every park I've ever seen is a government park. Those are good things. So labels aren't as helpful. What matters is substance, and what matters is whether people are being helped in an efficient and fair way. And that's what we should keep our focus on.
Jim?
Yeah.
Hi, it's Mark and Leslie, all the way
Hey.
down in Florida. It's good to see you.
All the way down there. We wish you were back home, Mark. Come on back.
Well, we miss you.
I hope it's warm down there.
It is, although it is interesting that we're finally in a state where our vote for president might actually count this year if Broward County can figure out how to count them.
Ooh, I like the beard, man. You're looking like an Old Testament prophet.
Thank you. That's been said earlier on the call. Leslie wants to ask a question about the post office.
I wanted to ask you about your view of the health of the postal department. Every day I get emails about how precarious it is, and it perhaps will crash in a very short time. And given the state of things for the election coming up, we are going to need the postal department. So will you give us a more realistic view of what it actually is happening with that?
Well, good for you, Leslie, for asking that question, because many people take the post office for granted, and you can no longer do that. By the way, I hope you're keeping up with your artwork and stuff.
Thank you. Yes.
The post office is in a $50 billion hole right now. I mentioned Tennessee being in a $1.5 billion hole. Republicans don't want to help us with the post office, even though guess what? The mail is bipartisan too. We all depend on the post office. It's just nobody wants to be around to clean up the mess. And the primary culprit here isn't COVID-19. It's email. You know, most all our communications are bypassing good old snail mail. That's really not the post office's fault. So there've been a number of suggestions to adjust their business model. We could probably do some of those things. There's been a suggestion, perhaps, the mail should be the way that, you know, liquor is supplied to people. You know, it's amazing, but it's basically a little bit of a dinosaur business, but it also knits America together. It's in the Constitution. Benjamin Franklin was our first Postmaster General. It was the internet of its day. And now Trump has just nominated this Republican fundraiser, which we think she's only been nominated so that she will kill any possibility of voting by mail in the fall. But that just shows the Republican strategic sense of even dismantling a sacred and constitutional institution just so they don't have to face the consequences of voter wrath this fall.
Congressman,
Yeah.
this is Ted Maiden. I hope you and yours are all
Oh yeah,
well.
hey Ted. Good to talk to you. We were business
likewise.
buddies. Wow. Yeah.
Likewise.
Weird. You haven't been using your quarantine period like Mark has.
No, I'm always lagging, Mark.
The Michigan hat, though. Huh?
That continues. Well, in that regard, I'm not lagging, Mark.
Well, he
but
keep threatening to make me cut his hair.
Look, we may wind up in a North Carolina, Michigan argument here. We don't want that to happen.
That's right.
Congressman, would you agree that we've witnessed a failure in large part, or maybe just in substantial part, of our state and federal public health system? And if so, do you think there's any bipartisan chance of addressing that shortcoming if indeed you perceive it?
Well, my mother-in-law was a public health doctor in Mississippi for 40 years. So she knew what it was like to be left behind because she worked with marginalized people her whole life. And people focus on public health when there's an emergency and they're worried they might get infected. But otherwise, it's kind of like our prison system. They don't want to think about it. They certainly don't want to be involved. The greatest public health tool that we have costs $99 and it's available at Home Depot, and it's the flush toilet. That's totally awesome. That enables cities to exist, and we all completely take that for granted. Now, there are other things that aren't as old-fashioned as the toilet, but like we were losing our vaccination rates due to the anti-vax movement. You know, largely not science-based, more based on paranoia, but we weren't even able to keep traditional childhood diseases at bay, like measles and things like that, because we were not even getting ourselves inoculated. And think of the more recent contagious scourges. You know, thank goodness Ebola went away, at least for the time being. But we had SARS, we had swine flu, we had H1N1, we had bunches of these things have been happening over time, and like, hello. But see, we take for granted these just-in-time supply chains, foreign-based. We take for granted that the whole world isn't going to get something. We take for granted that the market always works. And there's some places where the market is brilliant. There's some places where the market isn't so hot. But in terms of always supporting public health, you know, I wish we could count on that, but I hope our memories will be longer this time and we'll pay more attention so we can quash these diseases earlier and be better at managing them. Because as long as there's globalization, as long as there's air travel, as long as there's tourism, there's going to be threat of disease, and we've got to be able to manage that better than we have so far.
Any chance of bipartisan support for doing that?
Well, we can't even get many folks in the current administration to be for science. I'm hoping and praying Dr. Anthony Fauci won't be fired. or even Dr. Deborah Birx, as sweet and as innocent as she tries to be. You can see these people develop ulcers before our eyes
One of these
because they listen to this. Oh, why not inject ourselves with Lysol, or, you know, have ultraviolet light inserted into our bodies? It's like, oh my God, how can anybody say that? But when you have a president who calls himself a stable genius, this is what you get. You know, this, it's unbelievable.
Congressman Cooper.
Yes.
Hi, this is Deborah Olashansky. I'm bringing in some questions off of the YouTube. Thank you for joining us today. So here's a question from the YouTube group. Could you comment on the Tennessee unemployment system? Have you heard I have heard the application process is very challenging. Is there any chance of Tennessee unemployment running out of funds?
Well, believe it or not, Tennessee is overfunded in the unemployment area as well. We had a $4 billion fund before COVID even hit us. And now the federal government has given Tennessee an unbelievable amount of money, much of which the state is reluctant to even spend. I was on a conference call with the governor and the congressional delegation today, and many of my colleagues in the delegation didn't even want the $600 add-on federal benefit for unemployment, which, by the way, is probably the only thing keeping many Tennesseans even alive financially today. Because Tennessee, before COVID, had about the lowest unemployment benefit in America. And guess what? We were proud of it. The highest you could be paid was $275 a week. Who can survive on that? So that $275 plus $600, that makes $875, and that starts getting to be possibly livable. But I had colleagues on the phone today who were saying, well, that's keeping people from returning to work. Well, if you're offered your old job back, you have to stop unemployment because you're no longer eligible for it. But so many people, there are 3 exceptions here. If you need child care for your children and don't have any other way of providing it. If your kids are still at home due to the schools all being closed till the end of May. There's one other exception. I think if you have a provable doctor certificate health condition. But Tennessee has had an embarrassing unemployment system for as long as any of us been on this alive who are on this phone call. We've done nothing to fix it. It's kind of like the prison system, out of sight, out of mind until you need it. And then when your friends and neighbors need it, then it becomes an emergency. So the feds, it's really kind of a miracle that we got Republicans to vote for this extra $600 benefit, but it's not being spent as quickly and sensibly as it should. Now, in Tennessee's defense, their system was undergoing a software upgrade right as this all hit, and that was a pure unfortunate coincidence. Another factor is this: the Tennessee law never really treated independent contractors fairly, and many of our musicians are independent contractors. So they, before a federal law passed, were deemed ineligible because they were not employees. They were essentially sole proprietors of their own business. Now the federal law changes that, but it took a big software change for Tennessee to be able to handle that with its archaic system. So I hope we'll all be focused on public health. Ted made this question earlier, and on sort of the infrastructure of our state government, because under our federal system, a lot of what the Congress does is just turn over money to the states. And some states spend it sensibly, others really don't know what to do with the money. I hope y'all paid attention before COVID hit. The Beacon Center, a conservative think tank in Nashville, pointed out how our state had hoarded $730 million of aid designed to be spent for the poor and underserved in our community. But the state had refused to do that and just stockpile the money. That's just, it's astonishing. And this wasn't pointed out by any liberal group. This was pointed out by the Beacon Center. There's something rotten in Denmark here, and we need to work on this so that our state government is more transparent and more efficient and more equitable.
I think Denise Alper had a question earlier. Denise, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, my buddy Denise. Hey, glad you're on the call.
I wanted to ask the question, at a minimum, if we got all the Democrats age 60 and over to apply for absentee ballots, can our election commission handle the volume that, a deluge of applications?
Well, they probably cannot, we face this with almost all aspects of aid right now. For example, with unemployment, and there is a backlog of probably 100,000 cases right now. The governor told us on the call today that he had personally looked into one backlog of 20,000 and got those expedited, another backlog of 30,000 and try to get those expedited. And this isn't just a problem with state government. With the stimulus checks, you know, the $1,200 per citizen, the 60 million Americans who had their bank account listed with the IRS because they'd recently gotten a tax refund, those were easy to serve. But the federal government has had to hire people to handwrite checks for 5 million people a week. And that sounds like a lot, but we'll be writing checks for the April stimulus payment well into July and August, just because we didn't have their information. Now, this is a fundamental efficiency question. There are countries like Estonia, for example, where everybody's electronic and you can file your taxes, you can start a small business in about 3 seconds. But on the other hand, the government knows a lot about you and you have less privacy over there. And foreign countries like Russia were able to hack Estonia and pretty much shut the country down. So there are pros and cons to all this. But when it comes to delivery of aid, we've had trouble even with food stamps because that's a traditional program. It helps a lot of people. It needs to be helping a lot more people today because there are people today going hungry, and middle class people because they're having trouble getting by. And our friends in the other party have tried to limit the expansion of the SNAP program, the food stamp program, which is specifically designed to be counter-cyclical to help in times of economic distress.
Hi, Congressman Cooper. This is John Dabb. The massive spending has been essential that's been approved by Congress, but what's the talk about how that's ever going to get repaid? Is there the Republicans not considering any taxes in the future? I just see it being a big struggle.
Well, the best historical precedent is what we did with the World War II debt, which is about this high as a percent of GDP. And there it took a decade or two. Now in the 50s, we actually had shockingly high tax rates, even under Republican administrations. And it's unlikely we would return to, you know, really the confiscatory rates that were at the time. They were up to like 90%. So that's where the worry of inflation comes in, that politicians will chicken out, and instead of being explicit about taxation, they will essentially devalue the dollar. Now we face a curious situation here because as basically the most popular country in the world, this is why we have near zero interest rates today. People seem around the world have an insatiable desire to either buy condos in New York or LA or Miami, or to buy US Treasury banknotes, bills, and bonds, or to get anything else that's dollar denominated. Because as the world's reserve currency, we get $1 trillion worth of free benefit a year just because virtually every contract on the planet is denominated in our currency. You know, there are by far more dollars floating around outside of the United States than there are inside the United States. So we face this privileged position, but we should never take it for granted, because if there were to be a market basket of currencies other than the dollar that could compete with us, some people might view that as a safe haven. You know, there've always been some people who liked investing in Swiss francs or something, you know, but right now we are it. And that gives us probably more borrowing leeway than we deserve. You know, I probably should mention that within the CARES 1 Act, it was $450 billion for the Federal Reserve. And that sounds curious. Why would we loan money to the Fed? Well, see, they're able to leverage that 9 or 10 to 1. So that $450 billion for the Fed is really like $2 to $6 trillion. And this is astonishing. And only America has that much leeway right now. There are other countries that have a higher percentage of debt than we do. Japan's up at 200% plus, but the Japanese have a very high personal savings rate. And you probably saw before COVID hit, something like half of America didn't have $400 to tie themselves over if there's any sort of family mishap in the next month. So it's our credit card culture, our consumer culture, our spend now culture that has really made us vulnerable in these times of downturn.
This is Gil Fox. To extend on that question,
Mhm.
If we've increased the amount of debt by a third going through this, that means we're going to increase the amount of interest by a third. What's this going to do to future federal budgets?
Well, believe it or not, there's actually a school of thought now that with the interest rate really as near to zero as you can get, and in some countries it's already turned negative. It's hard to even imagine that, but it's a little bit like the price of oil turned to negative a few weeks ago, and who could even conceive of that? Or you would pay people to take your oil. Here it's free, and we'll pay if you take it. So we're in uncharted waters, and technically this has been called the death of the Phillips curve. In old-fashioned economics, when unemployment got very low, then companies were supposed to bid with higher wages to attract good workers. But as unemployment got down to unthinkably low levels, like 3%, when I was in school, full employment was 6% unemployment. And now but wages didn't really move up. They barely budged up a little bit. So this is a whole new economy, and we need a whole different type of economist to help us understand it. Now, some people love Paul Krugman, and he's great, and he won a Nobel Prize, but that was actually in a very limited trade area. There are other famous economists, Joe Stiglitz, Alan Binder. There's some great folks, but no one really has all the answers here. So in uncharted waters, you have to go very carefully. But I think right now debt levels are manageable, but they are approaching the unmanageable level. And we'll probably all spend the rest of our lives paying down this debt. But remember, that sounds gloomy. On the good news side, when the Fed stepped in historic terms in 2008 to rescue us, the Fed has made about $100 billion worth of profit every year for American taxpayers by having invested in the housing market, having invested in other American fundamentals when our capitalist system was not willing to do that. And by the way, people should, in terms of repairing things that should have been repaired years ago, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are still owned by the federal government. So essentially, we have a socialist housing market in America that nobody wants to talk about or think about. Now, Bob Corker, when he was a senator, tried to fix this, but we could never get consensus on how to bring those two venerable institutions back into regularity. So they're still essentially multi-trillion-dollar off-balance sheet, essentially socialist entities.
Congressman, it's Felicia Anchor.
Hey, Felicia, good to talk to you.
You too.
Share our friendship over the years. Thank you.
Absolutely. That brings to mind the talk about perhaps taking some of the unemployed and helping them work with some of the major infrastructure issues that we have in the country. Is there any conversation or any thought about how that could be reinstituted?
Mm-hmm. Great question. And we've been needing an infrastructure bill for a long, long time. When Trump was a candidate, his two best promises were to have a large infrastructure bill and to moderate prescription drug prices. And he's done almost nothing on either one. Right now, it's unlikely that our Republican friends are going to help us in any serious way on infrastructure. And that's too bad, because it should be totally bipartisan. Any engineer can tell you that our roads, bridges, our infrastructure is in serious hurt right now. And it's a great way to get people employed.
Right.
Right now, we need about 300,000 contact tracers. We're talking to the Peace Corps because they returned like 7,000 people from foreign countries recently. They're still being paid by Peace Corps. They need to be doing valuable work. David Brooks has an excellent column today in the Times talking about how now's the time for national service. I personally support that. I think all of our young people should spend a year or two, whether in the military and a non-military service, because it would help them appreciate America, it would help them appreciate their neighbors. And whether it's contact tracing or other things, there are ways that we desperately need help. And these young people and others who are volunteering could help us do that. And it would be well worth paying them to do it. There are certain economic dislocations that we face that could be repaired if government would nudge us in the right direction. This isn't necessarily big government, but encouraging people through incentives to do the right thing. And it's a lot of untapped potential. And we need to be looking at that, especially as unemployment is notching up toward 20%.
Just want to jump in and make sure your chief of staff had her hand up to ask a question, so I want to make sure she gets a chance.
Actually, actually, I didn't want to ask a question. I just wanted to follow up on the question about applying for absentee ballots if you're over 60 years old, and whether the state could handle that. The Secretary of State actually issued an invitation this afternoon for everyone in the state over 60 years old to apply for an absentee ballot. So it sounds like they think they can handle it. And I'd encourage everybody to do that. It's actually a very meager concession that you could only apply for an absentee ballot if you're over 60. We should all have the opportunity to have an absentee ballot, but that would require a change in the law. But at least we should be fully participating in the laws that are currently on the books. So if you're over 60, apply for an absentee ballot.
Good for you, Lisa. I hadn't been aware of that update. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Sure.
Lisa, by the way, is a survivor of COVID early on. She and her husband. And so you can survive this thing.
Any final questions for Congressman Cooper before he has to move on? I got one question sent to me privately asking me if you would care to speculate on Joe Biden's chances in the fall. I'm going to guess you'd rather take a pass on that, but do you have any final comments you'd like to share with us?
Well, I'm all for Biden. You know, he's served the public well for a long time. He's a known quantity, and I think he's approachable and reasonable in a way that perhaps we haven't seen. Final comment would be, please call on me if I can help you. My cell phone number is 615-714-1719. That's 615-714-1719. If there are any doubters, you can call it right now, check, it works. I even got a new battery charger this week because my old one had worn out. So the great thing about modern telecommunications is you don't have to go through anybody anymore. Now, I do have a wonderful staff, and Lisa Quigley is just a good example of that. She's a brilliant chief of staff for me. We try to be helpful and friendly. You know, in the old days with Federation, the main issue were things like passport problems and things like that. Now, sadly, we're dealing with graver issues than that. I wish that tourism would come back, because that's not only so educational, it's ennobling. And we've got to bring things back as much as we can. We got through the flu pandemic of 1918. We'll get through this one. It's just a rough patch, but hopefully we'll focus on more fundamental values now. It's amazing how the trivial things we thought about before and worried about and fought about now seem inconsequential. So let's focus on the big important things and our families, our country, our values, and we'll all be better as a result of this.
Great. Thank you, Congressman Cooper, for joining us today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us as well. On behalf of the Community Relations Committee of the Jewish Federation and Jewish Foundation of Nashville and Middle Tennessee, we were happy to put on this call, and please join us for our future ones. Next week, we'll have Erwin Benning talking about how to be an anti-racist and the community book group that we're going to hold around that. And then the week after that, we'll have State Senator Dixon talking about safe voting for the fall. So thank you again, and hope to see all of you next Friday.
Thank you.
Bye, Congressman.